All right, today we're diving into a text with a really radical premise called the Master Fiduciary. Now, its whole argument is that our entire legal and financial system is not what it appears to be. To really get our heads around this, we're going to break down its core concepts, and we'll be using the powerful allegories from the text itself to help us navigate some pretty challenging ideas.
So right out of the gate, the text hits you with this statement. It's a huge one. This isn't just some casual critique. It's the foundational belief that the system we're all living in is, well, basically an illusion. This one idea really sets the stage for a complete re-examination of everything we think we know about law and commerce.
So, to make sense of this framework, we're going to follow a pretty clear path. First, we'll look at the optical illusion the text is talking about. Then, we'll get into its main allegory, this idea of water versus oil. From there, we'll see how that leads to something called the joinder trap, explore the proposed way out, forensic separation, and finally, see what the end goal, walking on dry land, is all about.
Okay, so first things first, the source kicks things off by saying our reality is an optical illusion. It makes the case that what we see as a republic of law is actually more like a globally bankrupt ship of state, just trying to stay afloat on the high seas of insolvency. The core idea here is that the very foundation isn't solid ground like we've been led to believe.
So you have to ask, right? How is an illusion this big even maintained? Well, according to this text, it's done through something called the color of law. It's described as a facade, something that looks and feels like real, legitimate justice, but underneath it all, it's really a mechanism, an engine that runs entirely on debt. It's the very framework that makes the whole illusion feel so real.
Now we get to the absolute heart of this entire text. Seriously, to understand the logic of this worldview, you have to grasp this one central allegory, the idea that there are two fundamentally separate jurisdictions that just cannot mix, and it compares them to water and oil.
And this slide lays it all out perfectly. Look at the left side. You've got water. This represents the private jurisdiction. The source connects it with substance, life, clarity, actual facts, and the living, breathing man. Now on the right, you've got oil. That's the public. And that's the world of friction, debt, murkiness, legal presumption, and the person, which the text calls a mask. They're presented as total opposites that, by their very nature, should never mix.
Okay, so if these two jurisdictions are like oil and water, and they're supposed to be totally separate, what's the big deal? Well, according to the source, the problem is that they are being mixed, and not by accident. They're being mixed through a kind of fraud, creating what it calls the joinder trap.
The text actually calls this forced mixing joinder, but it uses a scientific term, emulsification. And if that sounds technical, it is, but it's a simple idea. Think about making salad dressing, right? You've got oil and vinegar. They don't want to mix. But if you add an emulsifier and shake it like crazy, they combine into one cloudy liquid. The source says this exact same principle is being applied to our legal system.
So, what's the emulsifying agent? What's the thing that forces these two separate liquids together? While the source claims it's the use of your name in all capital letters on official documents. By accepting this name, or by accepting a public benefit like a driver's license, you're basically agreeing to this mixture. And the result? The legal person is created, and the living man's actual substance gets trapped in that murky oil of public debt.
And the real-world consequence of being in this emulsified state is what the text calls an oil encounter. This is where the friction happens. We're talking taxes, fines, court summons. It's described as the state's murky, oily rules being applied to your private, clear substance. And that causes heat, friction, and what the source calls forensic anxiety.
So after laying out this whole problem, the source doesn't just leave you there. It actually proposes a solution. It lays out a very technical, procedural path, which it calls forensic separation, a step-by-step method for de-emulsifying, for actually separating the water from the oil again.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that the solution isn't just a philosophy, it's presented as a toolkit. These legal and commercial documents you see here are the specific tools the source says you can use to reverse that whole joinder process we just talked about.
The process itself is described in 3 stages, and it keeps that science metaphor going strong. First, you have to break the surface tension to pull your private substance back out of the public mix. Second, you create a hydrophobic barrier. Think of it like waterproofing a ship's hull to protect your estate from public debt. And finally, you spin the centrifuge of truth using legal processes to separate hard facts from public assumptions.
So where does all this lead? I mean, you go through this whole complex process. For what? What's the ultimate goal? The source calls it walking on dry land, and this is the final act of the entire journey.
And this brings us to a really crucial distinction the text makes. It argues that in that public realm of oil, ownership is actually a trap, because anything you own can be taxed or taken away. The real goal, it says, is private control. The idea is to own nothing in the public view, but control everything from the private side of things.
The ultimate prize, the thing you get at the end of all this, is something the source calls allodial title. It's described as a return to solid ground, the dry land that existed before the world was metaphorically flooded with the oil of public debt. It represents a final state of complete and total separation.
And we end with this final thought from the text, which really just wraps its entire philosophy up in a nutshell. Whether you see this as a practical guide or just a really complex allegory, the central message is a call to distinguish between what it says is murky and what it says is clear. And it leaves you with a critical question: in which fluid are you operating?